here this evening. 1 Peter chapter 4. Before we get into chapter 4, we want to go over a few reminders of things about the book. The epistle of 1 Peter is about be holy. As we've been pointing out, the key verse is found in chapter 1 in verses 15 and 16. But as he who called you is holy, you also be holy in all your conduct, as it is written, be holy, for I am holy. And so that's kind of that's the theme to this whole book, and our outline focuses on that theme. And so chapter 1, you have the call to be holy. Chapter 2, through the first part of chapter 3, we have suffering for being holy. In chapter 4, we have exhortations to those who are holy. And so that's where our focus has been in this book. Now, as we got into chapter 4 on Sunday morning, we went through several questions here, and I'm going to skip over these quickly. But as we pointed out in our study of the chapter, that we're really dealing with the idea of living as a Christian and what that entails. And so you've got to put away your past life. You've got to live in light of the end of all things, and you've got to suffer for being a Christian. Those are really the three main points that we run into here, in this chapter. And so as we focus on this chapter, we're looking at each of those. And the key verses we pointed out in our study on Sunday morning is found in verse 16. Yet if anyone suffers as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God in this matter. And as we pointed out, this passage here, this verse 16, is one of only three occurrences of the word Christian in the New Testament. And he tells us here that we need to not be ashamed when suffering for being a Christian. Coming into the chapter itself now, 1 to 6, which is what we covered on Sunday morning, is about putting away your past life. And so he said in this section, in 1 to 2, you need to arm yourself with the mind of Christ. And so in verse 1, therefore, since Christ suffered for us in the flesh, arm yourselves also with the same mind. So we said the ESV uses the phrase, the same way of thinking. The Legacy Standard Bible used the phrase, the same purpose. And as we pointed out, looking to the example of Christ, who also suffered, he suffered doing the Father's will, as we saw back in chapter 3, the just for the unjust. And as you go to the book of Matthew chapter 26, and in verse 39, Jesus suffered, not just the just for the unjust, but Jesus suffered because he did the Father's will. Remember, if possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but thine be done. And so why did Jesus go on to suffer? Because he submitted to the Father's will. And so when Peter's writing to those here in 1 Peter chapter 4, here people suffering for, as we have in our outline, being holy. They're suffering for being Christians. They need to look to the example of Christ, who suffered not because of some evil that he had done, but suffered for us, even though he was perfect. And so we need to look to that example in suffering. The second part of verse 1 says, for he who has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin. That's not talking about Christ, as we pointed out on Sunday morning. Because if it's talking about Christ, in order to cease from sin, would mean Christ had to first be guilty of sin. That's not fitting with the Scriptures. That's not fitting with what even Peter pointed out earlier in this same epistle. And so as you arm yourself with the mind of Christ, you've got to suffer in the flesh. And when you've done that, it's the one that ceased from sin. And as we pointed out, I think his point is not that we don't sin. We do. We may still sin. My little children, these things I write to you that you sin not, 1 John chapter 2. But if you do sin, we have an advocate with the Father. The point is, the reason they're suffering is because they've decided to cease from sin. They're no longer living like the world. More about that in verse 3. Verse 2, then, if you arm yourself with the mind of Christ, you should not walk in doing the will you spend the rest of your time in doing God's will and not in the lust of the flesh. Verse 2. 3 to 6, then, he talks about how we spend enough of our time in doing the will of the Gentiles. For we have spent enough of our past lifetime in doing the will of the Gentiles. The latter half of verse 3 then is what they spent enough time doing. So there's lewdness or sensuality, lasciviousness, licentiousness, depending on your translation. Lust, drunkenness, revelries. There's these drinking parties, or the Geneva translation, it's drinkings. That seems to be that's a reference to social drinking. And abominable idolatries, verse 3. All those things, and again, as we said Sunday, that's not an exhaustive list. He's just using that as a representation for, here's how the world is living, the types of things you need to be putting aside. You need to put away. You spent enough of your past life doing that. You've got to put that away. Verse 4, in regard to these things, they think it strange that you do not run with them in the same flood of dissipation, speaking evil of you. I had to thinking the other day that there's and there can be a lesson in here somewhere, but I can think of two examples, both in this book, where there's something that you would think is an insult. That is, people used it in today's society, it's supposed to be an insult, but really, if it's said to a Christian, is a compliment. One of those is, you're peculiar. Well, the King James Version used that phrase to say that those that are God's people are a peculiar people, his own special people, the ESV would say. The other one is, you're strange. That's supposed to be meant as an insult, but as God's children, the world needs to think that we are strange, verse 4, because we do not run with them in the same flood of dissipation. We don't do what they do. And so because of that, society should look at us and think, you know what, that person's strange. They don't live like everybody else does. That's not an insult. That's a compliment, because you're trying to live as God would have you to live. Verse 5 and 6 then, they will give an account to God, we will give an account to God, and that is why the gospel is preached. They will give an account to him who is ready to judge the living and the dead. For this reason the gospel was preached also to those who are dead, that they might be judged according to the men in the flesh, but live according to God in the Spirit. And so as we pointed out, the world should think us strange, as answer to question number 4. And the reason is that we don't do the kinds of things they do. We don't walk according to the flesh. Now, where we left off on Sunday morning was here at verse 7, because we spent a little bit of time on answering a question, and I'm going to go back and answer again, just as a refresher. And that is, what is the end of all things in verse 7, and then we'll talk about how we live in light of the end of all things. Verse 7, but the end of all things is at hand. And as we pointed out on Sunday morning, there are 3 views about the end of all things. One view is that he's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. Another view is he's talking about one's personal end. And the third view is there's the end of time, or the second coming. That's what he's got reference to. Those are the 3 positions. Maybe there's more positions, but those are the 3 positions held by conservative Bible students. Those that, that would be more conservative Bible students, those among brethren that are sound hold some of these different positions. And as we pointed out, and I'll go ahead and get to this again now, regardless of what position one holds, when I finish and state my position, you may say, you know what, I disagree. At the end, we're going to come out to the same conclusion, and I think we would agree there's some principles that can be applied. If you think it's the destruction of Jerusalem, there's principles that can be applied to the end of time. If you think it's the end of time, there are principles that for those facing the destruction of Jerusalem could have helped them. And so, regardless of the position you think that it is, there are some lessons that go back and forth, and so this is one of those we can disagree on, but it doesn't impact our salvation. We come out to the same ultimate conclusion. But for argument's sake, let's take a second and answer those. What is he considering? I think 2 real possibilities of those 3, 2 that I would think would fit better. One of those is the destruction of Jerusalem, and the other is the end of time. Maybe it is one's personal end. I think that would be the least likely of the 3. I want to focus on the main 2 that are held. The argument for the destruction of Jerusalem, I think the strongest argument is it's at hand. And so whatever is under consideration, verse 7, he says is at hand. That leaves the indication to most when you read that, whatever he's considering is imminent. I'll come back to that more in a minute. I think evidence suggests that it is probably, though, the end of time. Let me give you 3 reasons. Some of these are really answering why I don't think it's the destruction of Jerusalem. Number 1, the recipients aren't really all that close to Jerusalem. When we go back to the beginning and where we find them, they're quite a ways from Jerusalem. And so Why say, hey, you're facing sudden destruction in Jerusalem and they're many, many miles away? I don't think that's necessarily fits, though we do know there are Jews in this audience, at least some Jews in this audience, according to what we can get from the way that the book is written, but they're not near Jerusalem. Secondly, if this is it, the destruction of Jerusalem, it's the only mention or allusion to the destruction of Jerusalem in the book. Now, as I said Sunday, it doesn't mean that it can't be the destruction of Jerusalem. It may be the only reference and still be the destruction of Jerusalem. But it's something that almost seemingly he just all of a sudden says, oh, by the way, the destruction of Jerusalem's coming, and we leave. I think it fits better in the text as he's warning them about suffering and serving and having the mind of Christ, that it's in light of the end of all things and standing in judgment. The other one is it's the end of all things. The destruction of Jerusalem was the end of the Jewish system. When Jerusalem was burned, a lot of the genealogies of the Jews were lost. That Jewish system, that going back to the old law that some were still trying to keep, that was really the end of that in large part, but it wasn't the end of all things. Some hold that it is, but that's AD 70 doctrine. That's a whole other question. But even those that hold to the destruction of Jerusalem would tell you it wasn't the end. Most would say it's not the end of all things. And so I think that's an indication it's the end of time. And then real quickly on the at hand, the phrase at hand doesn't have to mean it is imminent. Romans 13:12, that our salvation is nearer than when we first believed. Makes the indication, well, it's got to be right there. No, it's not that it's imminent, it's that it's closer than it's ever been. James 5:8, Deuteronomy 32:35, Hebrews 8:13, other references to this idea of being at hand or some similar terminology. But again, I can give you the evidence as to why I think it's the end of time, and you may say, I think it's the destruction of Jerusalem. Fine. You know where we're going to end up? We're going to end up in the same place when we get to the end. The conclusion you're going to reach about the destruction of Jerusalem, and I'm going to reach about the end of time, are going to be the same conclusion. And those that say it's the destruction of Jerusalem will say, but the principles we learn here we can take and apply to the end of time. And maybe it is the end of time. And so, regardless of your position, the principles hold true of the end of time, whether it's the destruction of Jerusalem or the end of time, specifically under consideration in this text. Let's go ahead and go back to our questions here for a minute. Question number 6. Question number 6. What should we be in our prayers? Two things he says in verse 7. But the end of all things is at hand, therefore be what?
Sober and watchful.
Sober and watchful, or serious and watchful, depending on your translation, a few different phrases there. So, coming to verse 7 now. In light of the end of all things, our title to this point, our main point is living in light of the end of all things. So what do you need to do living in light of the end? You need to be serious and you need to be watchful in your prayers. What does that mean? Well, the word serious, according to lexicographer Lau and Nida, means to be able to reason and think properly and in a sane manner. The word watchful means to be well-balanced and self-controlled, according to BDAG. Lau-Nida says it means to be in control of one's thought process and thus not be in danger of irrational thinking. And so, really, when you take these two terms and the idea of being sane and clear, the idea is in your prayers you've got a clear way of thinking. I think in a couple of standpoints. One of those is when you're living in persecution as they are, you've got to make sure you're not letting that. You've still got to be clear maybe in what you're asking for. And not in the sense that God doesn't understand if we're not clear in what we say, but clear in our thinking. In that maybe we ask that the Lord's will be done and not just that we be delivered. His will may be that we give our life in that. I think the other side of it, though, and more so an application to us and living in light of the second coming, the idea of being serious and watchful is we've got to have focus in our prayers. Right? Our prayer is not something we should be distracted in our mind being in 100 different directions. We're going to the Almighty God, the Creator, in prayer. We need to make sure we're thinking in a sound manner, that we're clear-headed, that we're not irrational, but we're approaching Him with a degree of seriousness. Right? Prayer is something that is serious. There have been a number of songs through the years. There have been a number of times you've probably heard this statement. I don't like this reference that people talk about prayer as addressing the man upstairs. people sometimes treat prayer, I think it was several years ago, I heard the story of a man that got up to pray on Father's Day and said something about, beginning his prayer with Happy Father's Day, Daddy. No, we're approaching the Almighty God in prayer. We need to treat Him with reverence and respect. It's something He demands, and it's something that is owed to Him because of who He is. And so we've got to treat prayer as something to be serious and something that we're watchful and self-controlled in our thinking in our prayers to make sure our prayers are in a manner that's pleasing to God. So we've got to be clear-headed, to be reasonable and sane in our mind when it comes to prayer, specifically in this text, in light of the end of all things. We're going to give an account for how we've lived. We're going to give an account for how we've been in our prayer life. Have we been what we need to be? Do we address God with the reverence and respect He deserves? Are we praying with doubting, as James will talk about in James chapter 1? We're going to give an account for how we are in prayer. Verse 8, living in light of the end, have a fervent love. And above all things, have fervent love for one another, for love will cover a multitude of sins. There's a need to have fervent love, as he says here, for fervent love for one another. For love will cover a multitude of sins. Now, when he's saying love will cover a multitude of sins, that's not that love's going to cover up sin, right? The point is, I think when you have love one for another, true love for one another, this agape kind of love for one another, which is what this word is. It's a form of the word agape, translated fervent love. That love, I think in the idea of covering a multitude of sins, is that love's going to demand that if we have a brother or sister in sin, we're going to try to correct them. Not that we try to hide the sin and cover up the sin for them. Love covers sin because it's going to go to them, as we saw at the end of the book of James, right, and try to correct them. And then when they make that, if and when they make that correction, after we've approached them and rebuked them out of love, then that sin is going to be covered. It's going to be blotted out. It's going to be remembered no more. And so I think that's the sense in which love is going to cover a multitude of sins. It's not that we try to hide their sin. Love covers a multitude of sins because it's going to try to make sure that that person's sins are blotted out, that they do what they need to do to make necessary correction. Yes?
When Paul was stood Peter to the face when we read about Galatians chapter 2, obviously Peter made that break and he played the word hypocrite as much as Barnabas and others were carried away with the dissimulation. Peter's going to call him our beloved brother Paul. So when this works the way it's supposed to, Paul was actually demonstrating love for Peter when he done that. Because, that sin was going to separate him from God eternally if he didn't make it right. So Peter looks back, and he wasn't mad at Paul, obviously. He actually, I believe, demonstrates appreciation for the fact that, Paul did have the love and the courage to withstand.
You're right, and I think you go back to that text, to your point about how he stood condemned. Some translations say I was stood him to the face for he was to be blamed. But I think it's the New American Standard actually uses the phrase I was stood him to the face because he was to be condemned, which is he stood condemned before God because he played the part of the hypocrite. And that's why I withstood him to the face, was not because Paul was going to, hold it over Peter or something, but point out, Peter, you need to make this correction so that you can be right before God.
6:1 says, brother, if a man is overtaken in any trespass, you which are spiritual, restore such a one. How in spirit of meekness consider yourself, lest you also be tempted. So obviously, the Apostle Paul did it, I believe, with meekness. And he did consider himself. He said, I buffet my body, lest after teaching others, I myself be disqualified. So you can see all those components that are commanded in Galatians chapter 6 playing out as Paul is the one that did the rebuking, and Peter is the one that was the recipient of that.
Now you're right, and that is that example of Paul there serves as a good example for us as to how to go about it and why it's necessary as he rebuked Peter. We're into verse 9 now. Be hospitable to one another without grumbling. And so living in light of the end, it may seem like strange to us, live in light of the end, be hospitable toward one another without grumbling. But again, being hospitable, or the word hospitality actually means to entertain strangers. In fact, in Hebrews 13, where one of the passages that talks about hospitalities, some translations say, I think the New King James may do it, do not forget to entertain strangers. Others would say, do not forget to show hospitality. It's because that's what the word hospitality actually means, because back in the day, if somebody's driving through this area now, they can go get them a hotel or somewhere to stay. It wasn't always that easy back then. You couldn't run through, if you were on your way traveling, you couldn't run through a McDonald's drive-through and get you a hamburger to eat on the way. People relied in large part on the hospitality of others, the willingness to entertain strangers from others. And so be hospitable without grumbling. And I think part of that, as we think about hospitality, especially, again, living in light of the end of all things, is hospitality is a way in which we can grow closer to one another as we spend the time together. Well, as we grow closer to one another, that can help strengthen us so that we can encourage one another to, let's go back to the specifics of what they're dealing with, overcome the persecution and the trials, because it reminds us that hospitality and showing love can show each other that we're there with each other and for each other, even in the face of this persecution. Just on the other side, even the entertaining strangers part, opening your home to strangers, even, may show them that here's somebody willing to show love, even though the government in this case is coming after them for what they believe, may show them, here's somebody that lives different. And from the standpoint of inviting someone in that may not even be a Christian in the text of entertaining, and the idea of entertaining a stranger, may open a door of opportunity to them to teach them the gospel, especially living in light of the end of all things. Verse 10 now, be a good steward. As each one has received a gift, minister it to one another as good stewards of the manifold grace of God. Being a good steward of God's grace, being a good steward of the gifts that were given to us, and ministering to one another, maybe specifically to them in this day and time, dealing with spiritual gifts and using that to help strengthen and encourage one another. But even aside from that we're given many gifts from God, not just material gifts and even the spiritual gifts in the sense of salvation, not in terms of the prophecy and all that, but gifts, gifts of a spiritual nature that He's given us, but also the talents that we have that we can use to encourage and to uplift one another. We need to be good stewards of those. You think about some of the parables that Jesus told about stewards and being a good steward. We're going to give an account for how we've been a steward. Everything we have is a gift from God, and we've got to be good stewards of those things. Let's go to question number 7 now, before we get into verse 11. Question number 7. What should we speak as according to verse 11? It's the oracles of God. And so that's really what we're focused on in 11. If anyone speaks, let him speak as the oracles of God. If anyone ministers, let him do it as with the ability which God supplies, that in all things God may be glorified through Jesus Christ, to whom belong the glory and the dominion forever and ever. Amen. In verse 11 and verse 10, perhaps it would have been better to put those two together in an outline. And that is, if anyone speaks, speak as the oracles of God. If you minister, do so with the ability which God supplies. And the reason is that in all things God may be glorified. Looking back, I think 10 and 11 particularly are to go together, because speaking as the oracles of God means you're being a, verse 10, good steward. We're being a good steward of the message that God has given to us when we're speaking that message. Now let me take a second here. As we talk about speaking as the oracles of God, during the Restoration movement. Let me just real quick give a little bit of probably familiar with this, but a real quick history. There can be confusion. There is both a Reformation and a Restoration movement. The Reformation would have been Martin Luther. Their goal was to reform. the Catholic Church. Now, you ended up with off branches off of that because they didn't reform it, but you can hear it in there, the Reformation or Reformation movement. They were trying to reform the Catholic Church. The 1800s, there was the Restoration movement. That's where men like Alexander Campbell are remembered for, is the Restoration movement. That's when the statement came out from there that was often repeated. Talking about the Bible and that we've got to get back to the Bible, right? That was stated time and time again. But long before they ever talked about getting back to the Bible or speak where the Bible speaks and be silent where the Bible is silent, that's the exact point Peter made in 1 Peter 4 and in verse 11. He didn't use that phrase, but he said, if you speak, speak as the oracles of God. If you're living in light of the end and you're going to be this good steward, that's going to require you to speak God's word and speak in biblical terms. That's going to require you to speak what all God says. And so we got to speak as the oracles of God. And I think about a few ways in which that's done. One sense, we speak as the oracles of God, and that our message is and only is from God's Word. And I thought through some ideas, perhaps at some point, for some lessons on this idea of speaking as the oracles of God. One way we speak as the oracles of God is just teach what the Bible teaches. Don't add to it. Don't take away from it. But another sense, I think, maybe we'll forget, in speaking as the oracles of God, I think is using Bible terms in Bible ways. And what I mean by that is there are some terms that are misused by the religious world, but are also misused sometimes among brethren. And so sometimes you'll hear people use the word Christian. And I'm not talking about the world. I'm talking about brethren. Somebody being a good Christian, and if they haven't followed the New Testament plan of salvation, they may be a good person. That's not a Christian. Sometimes we're influenced by other things like terms like pastor and how they're misused. Sometimes we avoid them because of how they're misused in the religious world. And some find themselves adopting those terms whether they realize it or not. That's not speaking as the oracles of God. Speaking as the oracles of God is speaking God's word, only God's word, not adding to it, not taking from it, and using biblical terms and biblical ways. And when we do that, you know what we are according to verse 10? We're good stewards of what we've received from God. Let's go on to verse 12 to 19 in the time we've got remaining. 12 to 19, suffering as a Christian. Let's go here and get a couple of questions real quick. Or one question real quick. Question number 8. What should we not think strange? According to verse 12.
The fiery trial.
The fiery trial, or specifically, as we think, the fiery trial is the term he used. The broader sense in which they're talking in the book, the fiery trial referring to persecution. It's not something that we should find strange. So let's look at verse 12 now. Beloved, do not think it strange concerning the fiery trial which is to try you, as though some strange thing happened to you. The ESV, instead of saying the strange, translated it by, Beloved, do not be surprised when concerning the fiery trial. Should it surprise us when persecution comes as a Christian? Should we think, well, that's strange. Why is that happening? No. That's something that we shouldn't sit back and be surprised and think, well, that's strange. Why is that happening? No. We should know ahead of time. That's part of being a Christian, is those things are going to happen, as Paul would point out in 2 Timothy 3 and in verse 12. Let's go ahead and get another question here real quick. Question number 9. Why should we rejoice in suffering? Look at verse 13. But rejoice to the extent that what? You share or partake of Christ's suffering. So again, as we go back through the book and what we've seen at the end of chapter 3 and into chapter 4, Christ also suffered. Chapter 2 even, Christ suffered, setting us an example, right? To this you were, chapter 2, called. All right? Because Christ also suffered. Chapter 3, he suffered the just for the unjust. Chapter 4, Christ also suffered for us in the flesh. So now we're suffering. Why can we rejoice? Because we get to be partakers of the suffering of Christ. Christ suffered for us. Now we get to suffer for Christ. That's something to have joy about, not sorrow or self-pity. Yes.
Jesus said, blessed are those who persecute for righteousness' sake. They shall see the kingdom of heaven. So real early on in his gospel ministry, his earthly ministry, he made this point that if you're blessed, and some verse says, happy are you if you're persecuted for righteousness' sake. Well, that's kind of counterintuitive the way we normally think. We think, well, we want to live a life without suffering. But that was brought out real early in Jesus' earthly ministry.
You're right. And it's something that the apostles would repeat throughout their teachings time and time again, as Peter's doing here, as Paul did all numerous times, reminding them you're going to suffer, and when you do, you need to be rejoicing in it. James pointed that out as well, as we saw in our study of James. Verse 13 and 14 now. But rejoice to the extent that you partake of Christ's sufferings, that when his glory is revealed, you may also be glad with exceeding joy. If you are reproached for the name of Christ, blessed are you, for the Spirit of glory and of God rest upon you. On their part he is blasphemed, but on your part he is glorified. Verse 13, but rejoice to the extent that you partake of Christ's sufferings. I like the New American Standard and Legacy Standard there. And it's a subtle difference, but instead of saying rejoice, it says keep rejoicing. One of the things both of those translations I think do an excellent job of is making sure that when the verb is more in the active sense of making sure they translate it as that. The idea that Peter's telling them is not, you know what, it's about time you start rejoicing. They should already be rejoicing in trials, and the reminder should be, you know what you need to do? Keep on rejoicing as you face the trials. Maybe in the sense of they've already rejoiced in trials, or maybe in the sense that they were rejoicing before the trials, and you know what? Now that you're facing trials, you keep rejoicing. Even though you're in the midst of trials, you keep rejoicing that you're suffering because you're partakers, as he said, verse 13, you're partakers of of Christ's sufferings, that when his glory is revealed, you may be glad with exceeding joy. You're joyous now that you can suffer for him, that you may have joy ultimately in eternity when Christ is revealed. Yes.
Jesus also warned about that because he said in the parable of the sower, he said one of those things that's going to cause some people to fall short. Persecution, tribulation, because of the word. That's going to be the thing where some of those that started down the path actually severed the relationship. So if a young Christian knows in advance that there's going to be these persecutions, tribulation, hopefully we'll be way more aware of the tactics the devil's going to use to try to keep you right in his kingdom, after you come. So Jesus made this room.
Yes, you're right. Coming out of verse 14, more in verse 14, if you are reproached for the name of Christ. The English Standard, Legacy Standard would say, if you are insulted. The New American Standard of 95 would translate it by the word reviled. So the idea is there's some sort of ridicule. You're insulted or reviled or reproached because of Christ. And for the name of Christ, blessed are you. For the Spirit of glory and of God rest upon you. On their part he is blasphemed. That is, they're blaspheming him. How? By persecuting you because of what you believe. But on your part he's glorified. Why? Because you're suffering and rejoicing in suffering for the sake of Christ. Verse 15 and 16 now. Do not be ashamed, but glorify God. Verse 15. But let none of you suffer as a murderer, a thief, an evildoer, or as busybody in other people's matters. Yet if anyone suffers as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God in this matter. First, verse 15. Don't suffer because you're doing evil. In fact, there's no joy in suffering for doing evil. You're receiving what's due you for what you've done. Right? If somebody's guilty of murder and they're executed, they're receiving the punishment for the crime. If somebody steals something and they're locked in prison for whatever amount of prison sentence they're given, they're receiving the punishment for the crime. But if somebody's put into prison or put to death because they serve God, they're being put to death or in prison unjustly. That's why they should be rejoicing, because they're not receiving a punishment for something bad they did. It's because they're doing what's right. Don't be ashamed, verse 16, but glorify God in this matter. Question 10 now. What should we commit our soul to, or to who should we commit our soul? Verse 19, it should be committed to, verse 19, it should be committed to God and to his will. Now, verse 17 to 19, we will be judged, therefore suffer according to the will of God. Some think this could again be reference to the destruction of Jerusalem. I think it's reference to the end of time, but that's in large part depending on how you interpret verse 7. But again, you come out to the same conclusion. Let's look at 17 to 19. For the time has come for judgment to begin at the house of God. And if it begins first with us, what will be the end of those who do not obey the gospel of God? Now, if the righteous one is scarcely saved, where will the ungodly and the sinner appear? Therefore, let those who suffer according to the will of God commit their souls to him in doing good as to a faithful Creator. We'll have a lot of time, so let me just hit on this real quick. What's he saying in 17 and 19? Well, the point he's saying is there's going to be judgment. And so you got to be willing to suffer according to the will of God and for the will of God to be saved, because what's going to happen to those that are ungodly, and it's implied and pointed out, they're going to be suffering but for eternity. So let me hit on a couple phrases real quick. What will the end of those be who do not obey the gospel of God? Some have the idea that in eternity we're going to stand there and God's just going to let everybody in. And can you imagine, if you're Paul or you're Peter and you're standing there and you gave your life because of your service to Christ, you think, well, how unfair that we suffered for doing what's right, and now they get to just walk on in even though they did what was evil. Right? God's a just God. Verse 18, if the righteous one is scarcely saved. The point there is not that, well, the righteous is just barely saved. That's the idea the New King James points out. The idea is it's with difficulty, as some other translations put it. And that is, if the only way the righteous are saved is because they endure these difficulties, then what's going to happen to the ungodly and the sinner? And the answer is they're going to suffer for all eternity. Lord willing, we'll pick up in chapter 5 on Sunday morning and perhaps finish the book.